За 262 рішення прийнято. Я вітаю народ України з створенням Національної гвардії України. Будь ласка, по фракціям.
As early as March 13, 2014, the law on the National Guard was passed. Formally, the internal troops were renamed the National Guard of Ukraine. But there was one important point. The formation of volunteer battalions began under the aegis of the National Guard of Ukraine. On March 14th, the first volunteers went straight from the Maidan to the training base in Novi Petrivtsi on the outskirts of Kiev. These people, although not always experienced fighters, were highly motivated. Their contribution to the defense capability of the country was enormous. Now, March 14th is celebrated as the Day of Ukrainian Volunteers. This is the 6th series of the film about the ATO, History of the War. We're trying to get to the bottom of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, its reasons and results. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? How does the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia pose a potential threat to Europe overall? In April and May 2014, Ukraine was in a very awkward situation. President Yanukovych fled the country, which gave birth to an exceptional legal case. Ukrainian legislation did not envisage such a situation. The constitution outlines options for the development of events in the event of death, illness, and loss of legal capacity of the president. He could even resign, but the notion of a runaway president was not fixed in the main law of Ukraine. In the absence of the head of state, his duties fell on the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, Alexander Turchinov. Ukraine needed a legitimate power structure that would be recognized by the entire civilized world. That is why early presidential elections were scheduled to be held on May 25th. That is also why the anti-terrorist operation regime was introduced. In the context of the ATO, without declaring martial law, the use of armed forces is very limited. This resulted in the vulnerability of the latter when confronted with an aggressively geared-up crowd, as well as the so-called People's Militia. After all, once an insurgent dropped or hid weapons, such a person ceases to be something different from a civilian, and the army cannot apply force on that person. This fact was actively exploited by terrorists, and the population, deceived by propaganda, served as a human shield during various actions. At that time, the police forces and units of the National Guard had the full legal right to conduct searches and inspections in the conditions of an increasingly charged-up environment. It was volunteer police units that played the role of a scalpel, with which the Ukrainian command carved the metastasis of separatism from the body of society. Ideally, everything should have looked as follows. Armed forces surround and block the city, and then the National Guard enters the fray. However, in reality, everything was much more complicated. The Russian Federation actively supplied militants with not only small arms, but also anti-tank and anti-aircraft complexes. After the seizure of the self-propelled mortar vehicle Nona by the militants, a few days later, at least 2 more such vehicles arrived from the territory of Russia. Receiving supplies from the Russian Federation, the terrorists became highly active. Thus, on May 13th, 20 kilometers from Kramatorsk, a group of militants ambushed the convoy of the 95th Brigade, and as a result of the shooting, 5 Ukrainian paratroopers were killed. An armored personnel carrier and a truck were also lost. The losses of militants are estimated in at 2 to 10 individuals. The unofficial status of the so-called militiamen does not allow us to accurately track their losses. After all, it's enough to just take the weapons from the body of a killed militant and the armed insurgent turns into a civilian. This nuance was successfully exploited in Russian propaganda, which was passing off combat losses of terrorists as the extermination of civilians. Back in March, at the very beginning of the events in Crimea and almost immediately after Putin's statement on the use of the Russian armed forces on the territory of other countries, partial mobilization of military forces began in Ukraine. On the eve of the presidential elections, Ukraine won the time necessary for the recruitment of the army. On May 14th, terrorists proclaimed that they were going on the offensive. Also, there were allegations that more than 20 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed. However, this information was nothing more than a dirty propaganda trick aimed at intimidating the population. It is not difficult to verify the falsity of such an assertion. From the very beginning of the anti-terrorist operation, the names of the fallen in the ATO are regularly published on the internet in an open access mode. Unlike Russian militants, the Ukrainian authorities never kept the losses in secrecy. Overnight into March 15th, Ukrainian security forces cleared a 5-kilometer zone around the TV tower on Mount Karachun. At the same time, the militants' base near Kramatorsk was destroyed. The soldiers of the 1st Reserve Battalion of the National Guard of Ukraine played an active role in this operation. Speaking of volunteers, one should not forget that a large number of people went not to police battalions. However, a man who came to the military enlistment office without a call-up was nevertheless handed a draft notice. And it is very difficult to track how many people were mobilized into the armed forces voluntarily and how many were called up. The Ukrainian system of accounting of a person obligated to military service left open many windows of opportunity for potential draft dodgers. Most people who join the army or the police during this period are in fact volunteers. On May 16th, the General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as terrorist organizations. On the same day, the militants attacked a base of Ukrainian security forces near the city of Izum in the Kharkiv Oblast. Not far from the village of Uspenka in the Luhansk Oblast, unknown people fired at the separatist checkpoint. Subsequently, the pro-Ukrainian guerrillas will draw a lot of blood of both separatists and the rank-and-file soldiers of the Russian military forces. May 17, 2014, when trying to travel from Russia to Ukraine, the head of the Luhansk People's Republic, Valery Bolotov, was detained at the border. However, about 80 militants attacked the frontier post and liberated their leader. Appeal of the commander of the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, dated May 17, 2014. The appeal was written by me personally. On the same day, the leader of the separatists, Igor Girkin, made a television address in which he complained about the insufficient activity of the population of Donbass. Girkin complained that the locals do not want to fight, referring to the shortage of men ready to fight for the so-called Novorossiya. Girkin announced the start of recruiting women into his army. If men are not capable of this, I will have to call up women. I officially gave the order to accept them in the militia. The turnout for a referendum on the independence of Donbass was not high. There were no throngs of people ready to fight against Ukraine. Even back then, at the end of May 2014, a simple fact became obvious. An attempt to launch a civil war in the east of Ukraine failed, and without the support of the Russian Federation, everything will end very quickly. At the same time, the Ukrainian army was gaining strength, manning and putting forward more and more units to the front. Military equipment was actively repaired. Many weapons units were withdrawn from storage. In this regard, the country was very fortunate. When Soviet troops left East Germany in 1991, they left most of the equipment and weapons on the territory of Ukraine. And the remnants of the greatness of the Western group of forces were added to the warehouses designed to ensure vital activity of the million-strong army that guarded the western borders of the once invincible Soviet Union. There was a huge amount of weapons and equipment. By 2014, a myriad of ammunition of all calibers and types, weapons, tanks, and armored personnel carriers was still stored in the warehouses of the Ministry of Defense. However, the hardware was in terrible condition. Due to the low funding of the army, over the years it has become common practice when stored equipment became a donor of spare parts. But the equipment was systematically revived and put into operation. Often thanks to the efforts of volunteers or relatives of soldiers, or the financing of commercial structures and private philanthropists. The spring-summer of 2014 showed the world a new Ukrainian army. The army really became a well-armed people's militia. On May 18th, several militants were neutralized as a result of a special operation in the area of the Kramatorsk Airfield. They were preparing to attack the airfield and helicopters. It is interesting that together with a group of terrorists, Ukrainian special forces seized two journalists of the live news television channel Oleg Sidyakin and Marat Saichenko. A Polish portable air defense missile system Grom, which is an analog of the Soviet man-pads Igla, was found in the trunk of their vehicle. Here it should be specially noted that Russian journalists were privy to the backstage of the militants. They conducted live broadcasts of battles, were present at the interrogations of prisoners, and on some occasions even questioned Ukrainian soldiers themselves. Overnight into May 19th, terrorists attacked checkpoints and a base camp near Slavyansk, where 3 Ukrainian soldiers were injured. One militant was killed when fire was returned. Another terrorist was wounded and subsequently detained. The first night battles revealed a severe need for night vision devices, since the Soviet models that the army had were obsolete and ineffective. At first, the supply of the army and the National Guard with night optics fully came upon the volunteers. Night fighting continued on May 21st. The militants once again attacked one of the checkpoints near Slavyansk and the supply convoy of the ATO forces, and in the end, both attacks were repelled without losses. However, the next day, a black cloud hung over Ukraine. The plan of the Ukrainian command was to dissect the territory under the control of the militants into several parts. In combination with the blocking of the border, this would allow, by curbing the supply of arms and people from Russia, to encircle and liberate the occupied settlements. In turn, the Kremlin in every possible way resisted this scenario, exerting pressure both on the diplomatic front and on the real front. On May 22nd, Russian special services carried out a simultaneous attack on Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Unfortunately, not all of the Ukrainian military understood the seriousness of the situation. Despite the danger of attack by the saboteurs, the necessary measures for protection and defense were not taken. There were also no trenches and no shelters. On the eve, local residents freely moved closer to these positions, At about 4:30 a.m. on May 22, 2014, militants under the command of Lieutenant Colonel of the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Russian Federation, Igor Bezler, attacked a detachment of the 51st Brigade. They approached closely in several vehicles and opened fire at point-blank range. But after a while, the surviving soldiers were able to organize a line of defense and managed to call for air support. As a result, the enemy suffered losses, and while abandoning one vehicle, it retreated, but was unable to capture the wounded officers. As a result of the battle, 16 people were killed and about 30 were injured. 3 uatvs and several cars were lost. At that time, these were the greatest single losses of the armed forces of Ukraine. On the same day, on May 22nd, a unit of the 30th Brigade was attacked near the railway station Rubizhne. 2 IFVs and 1 Gas-66 truck with an anti-craft Zu-23 guns were lost. 3 soldiers perished. The next day, on May 23rd, militants fired at an ambulance, killing a soldier wounded in battle near Volnovaha. 2 more people were killed as a result of the sniper fire at a checkpoint near the village of Zolotay Kolodias. And in the village of Karlivka, a detachment of the Donbass Volunteer Battalion engaged in its first battle. That day, 5 Ukrainian patriots were killed, 5 were wounded. The leader of the terrorists, Igor Bezler, announced the capture and execution of 2 soldiers. However, this information was not true, seeing as nobody was captured. As a result of this chain of failures, the pace of advancement of Ukrainian troops has dropped dramatically. Russia began an intensive transfer of heavy weapons, trained personnel, and a huge amount of ammunition across the border. Very soon, the combat in the ATO zone turned into a real war zone with the intense use of barrel artillery and rocket launching systems. But time was bought, and the elections were held on May 25th. Ukraine received a legitimate president and the army, namely its commander-in-chief.